I recently purchased a Vilros aluminum starter kit with a Raspberry Pi 4B 8GB model and also an Argon 1 Raspberry Pi 4B case. So I just wanted to share my thoughts and my experience for anyone that might be interested in purchasing either one of these. The one that I purchased first was the Vilros case with the Raspberry Pi 4. When it arrived, the main or outer box was damaged, but all of the accessories and boxes inside were not. I ordered the kit from Newegg and wasn't quite sure what to expect aside from a few obvious accessories such as the power adapter and HDMI cable. Some of the confusion was due to that in the images for the product there are items such as thermal paste, but in the description or list of included items there was no mention of it. And some of the descriptions were a little vague, while some items that were not included in the list were actually in the kit. Another point of confusion was that initially I had meant to order the Vilros case, the aluminum case with the fan. I'm not sure how, but somehow I ended up with the wrong Raspberry Pi kit. Although I'm willing to take the blame for it, perhaps I made a mistake somewhere. But even with that case, I was unsure if it came with the fan or not. The fan is included in the picture of the product for the product, but in the items included list, it wasn't quite clear to me if the fan came with the case or not. So that was one of the first things I noticed when I opened up the kit, was that not only did it not come with a fan, but there was no room for a fan to begin with. The Raspberry Pi was in great condition. Box it came in, the board, and it came with instructions and a small reference card. All the other items looked good as well. It came with screws, thermal tape, power adapter, HDMI. It came with rubber feet for the case, instructions, reference material, a 32GB SD card with noobs. I didn't really notice anything wrong with the kit until I went to place the Raspberry Pi into the case itself. At first I thought that I had misread the instructions because the board was not fitting into the case. But it didn't take long for me to realize that the board didn't fit into the case. Namely, two areas in the case lacked ample room for the Raspberry Pi board itself. The first area that I noticed was where the audio jack for the board goes through this porthole. And the second thing that I noticed was these two tabs that the board sits next to. I'm assuming they are meant to be placed in an area where they are snug against the board, but they were so far in towards the board that the board would simply sit on top of them. Even though I tried to place the side of the board with the HDMI ports and audio jack port in first. So, using the hex key / Phillips head screwdriver that came along with the kit, I filed or removed some of the material for the port that aligned with the audio jack, and this helped. And I did the same thing with the two tabs on the opposite side of the board. And as soon as I did that, I noticed the board began to fit in a little more. So now you have one side with the ports going in a little bit, and then the side with the tabs, the board is at an angle. All in all, I think I spent 3 hours or more with this hex wrench, scraping, grinding, filing away at the tabs and the initial hole for the jack. It eventually moved on to the rest of the holes. Even with that much time spent on it, the board didn't quite fit, and I didn't want to force it down. As it was, on the edge of the board, there are these small teeth perforation on the board, and just from me testing to see if it would fit, where the two tabs are, some of those teeth began to wear away. So eventually, I used actual files, needle files, and spent maybe another 2 hours, maybe a little longer actually, but now the board fits. After getting over that problem, the case actually closes up very neatly and is very sturdy. There was some issue getting the case to fit, on the top of the case to fit, because as I placed it on top of the Raspberry Pi to close the case, there are these limbs that reach between the Ethernet and USB ports, and those either did not line up properly or were just a little too wide. And anytime I deal with something that small and delicate, I get a little nervous that I'm going to break it. There were some creaking and crunching sounds, but nothing was broken. and it eventually did fit together. And as I said before, once the case was put together, it was actually sturdy and had a clean look and feel to it. Everything else worked fine. The power adapter, the HDMI cord, the noobs on the SD card installed with no problem. Aside from the board not fitting initially, the kit did end up working. Not being entirely satisfied, mostly because I initially wanted a case with a fan, or at least room for a fan for me to install one. Mainly because I plan to overclock this Raspberry Pi and would like to run Ubuntu 20.10 on it. So I purchased the Argon 1 case. My experience with this case was different. It arrived quickly. All the boxes, including the outermost box, was in great condition. The way that the items were placed in the box was very elegant and clever, and everything had an air of prestige. The weight of the case, the look of the case, aesthetically it was very pleasing, and overall went together just fine. Again, there were some issues where, for example, when I'm placing the extra board to turn your ports 90 degrees so that all your ports are on the back, when I was putting that onto the Raspberry Pi, again, there were some of those creaking and crunching sounds, even though I try to be extremely careful. And there was some of that when putting the entire case together as well. But nothing was damaged, and once it was all put together, it was a very nice case. Very nice weight to it. The feet made it very grippy. It didn't slide around. The weight helped with that as well. Came with its own power cord and so on. The experience was really great. Went together quickly. I had no issues up to that point. When I went to start or boot up the Raspberry Pi is when the issues began. So when booting up the Raspberry Pi, the screen flickered from black to the images that you would expect when booting up a Raspberry Pi, except they had a cyan or blue-green tint to them. And before the Pi would actually boot, the screen would just go black. And no matter what I did, I could not get past this issue. I went into recovery mode, and that image would in some way stay. It would still flicker on and off, and it still had the cyan tint, but at least the screen would not stay black. This made it difficult to even shut off the Raspberry Pi. Using the power button on the Argon 1 case, I tried to soft shut off the Raspberry Pi as much as possible, but more often than not, it ended with a hard shut off. I took the case apart, tried to see if maybe there was a bad connection between the boards. Maybe I hadn't pushed the board far enough into the Raspberry Pi, or maybe it was sitting at an odd angle. Visually, everything seemed fine. I tried different HDMI ports when I would boot up the Raspberry Pi, but unfortunately, nothing I tried worked. So even though the Argon aesthetically is more pleasing than the Vilros case, and overall has this air of prestige to it, it's a very elegant case, unfortunately for me, it didn't work. I eventually put the Pi back into the Vilros case, and unfortunately had to reinstall noobs due to all the hard shutoffs while in the Argon 1 case. Fortunately, I hadn't done that much with Raspbian yet. I had installed GIMP and Inkscape and a few other things, but hadn't really done much, so it wasn't a big loss. And speaking of the operating system, so far I'm really liking it. I do have another SD card prepared for Ubuntu 20.10, but I think for now I'm going to keep playing with Raspbian. I'm really liking the experience. Initially, when I began using it, I didn't see some sort of store, some sort of repository for programs or apps. So, and I think it's mainly this habit that I've gotten into lately, at least, where if I don't find something in the GUI immediately, I just default to the command line and do whatever I need to do there. And it kind of makes me think of shortcuts, where there was a time long ago now where I simply stopped looking for those general shortcuts in menus. So instead of going to File or Edit for something like copy, paste, or I just simply started using the keyboard shortcut regardless of the software, whether it was my first time on it or if it was a new piece of software, simply because it was easier and faster, hence the name shortcut. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. So, of course, later when I was playing with the Raspberry Pi, I found that there is a store on there. But it's good to know that the command line works just as I would expect it on something that's running Debian or Ubuntu. Even though I knew that Raspbian is based on Debian or is Debian, I didn't really know exactly what to expect. But so far, it feels just like any other Linux experience I've had. It's a little closer to something like XFCE, where it's simple and light. I haven't played with it that much. But just from the first impression that I'm getting, I think XFCE has more options. But I'm sure that just like XFCE, using the command line or even perhaps the store, I can add a lot more customization to it. But I really don't think I need any or much more at this point. I really enjoy the simple UI, to be honest. Clicking on the About section on the menu bar shows that Raspbian is using LXDE, which is why I think this seems so familiar. I've used that with AnLinux on Android, along with XFCE, although I would say this reminds me more of XFCE. But because of that, it's very familiar and I'm really enjoying it. And speaking of this lightweight UI, as of yet, I haven't overclocked the Raspberry Pi, and I'm very pleased with the speed. It's very snappy. Now, maybe that's because my PCs are just too ancient now and I've gotten used to their slower speeds. Or maybe it's because the operating systems are running are just very resource intensive. Either way, I'm very happy with it and I'm looking forward to using it more as an actual PC. And some of the reasons for myself wanting to use it as a PC is its small form factor and its low power consumption. And I do want to spend more time with it and review it further with those two aspects in mind. I think it's a sort of thing that would be useful for someone living in a small space. So whether it's a small apartment, an RV, a van, or even a car, the small form factor and the small power consumption should be very accommodating for those types of environments. Or even if a person just wants to save space on power in their home. But definitely, if you're living in a situation where your electricity is reliant on some sort of battery, whether it's lithium or lead acid, this is going to take very little power compared to a full-size PC, while still giving you, from what I've seen, a lot of the same kind of performance. Definitely not a high-end or gaming PC, but definitely a decent PC. Now, I do think that the power consumption is comparable to a modern laptop or tablet, so there's that to consider as well. But I think the smaller form factor, the ability to customize, and the fact that it's going to work so easily with Linux-based operating systems lends a lot of weight to the Raspberry Pi. At least in my case, because if I were to buy a modern laptop, the first thing I would do is try to change the operating system to some sort of Linux distro. And with Android tablets, even though every day they're more powerful and more capable in terms of software, I still rather have that desktop experience. So finally, going back to my original intention with this Raspberry Pi, I still want to overclock it to get the most performance out of it. And of course, that's going to lead to a heating issue and it needs some sort of cooling solution. And although this aluminum case does seem to dissipate heat pretty well, I don't think I want to risk or put all my eggs in that basket when I overclock the Pi. So I am still looking at cases that have active cooling of some kind. But for the meantime, I think I'm just going to play with this case. And I also have a harebrained idea that occurred to me that I thought I would share. And that's, what if through active cooling, I can get results good enough to allow me to overclock the Raspberry Pi without having to worry about overheating. And so the idea that I had was, since water takes so much energy in terms of heat, and it's so dense, maybe a small water bottle sitting on top of the aluminum case can absorb a lot of that heat, since the case is being conducted through the aluminum anyway. Now there's always, of course, there's always a risk of getting water on the Raspberry Pi, but I think that risk can be mitigated by either placing the bottle in some sort of secondary containment unit, whether it's a Ziploc bag or maybe maybe gluing the lid or maybe using a little bit of plastic welding. But another idea that I thought of as far as a containment unit was using a larger plastic bottle. For example, there are these bottles that they sell multivitamins in, usually the gummy variety, where they're kind of rectangular, wide, with a wide mouth for the lid. It kind of looks like a glass bottle from a Zelda game, to be honest. But maybe one of those is big enough to hold a plastic bottle inside. Now, one issue I can see with that is that much, and also the plastic on those bottles tend to be thick from what I've seen. The next issue that would arise from that is that the amount of plastic between the case and the water would inhibit conduction. But still, I thought it would be fun to play with that, and a simple test should be able to tell me if just how harebrained the idea really is. But if it does work, it might be a simple passive cooling solution. That was my experience so far with the Raspberry Pi and these two cases. I hope they were useful and helpful. Thank you for watching.